so welcome. This is Ben Llewellyn, and today I want to show you how the Portuguese language is really in a class all by itself. There's something really unique about this language.
Isn't there?
With sounds like
Veio o senhor ministro dizer que não. Claro que tinha que se mostrar.
It's got its own thing going on. And is this because of the Celtic groups who were there before? How Celtic is Portuguese? Let's start with what we know. Portuguese is a Romance language, but what stands out about it amongst the other bigger Romance languages like Spanish, Catalan, Romanian, Italian, French, there are others, but what stands out about it is there's a lot of vowel sounds in Portuguese and French actually. These two have a lot of vowels and a lot of sounds generally, not just vowels. Linguist Mario Pei wrote in 1948 about the vowel shift in these various Romance languages from Latin, and he calculated the degree which these languages, at least in terms of the vowels, not the rest, had shifted from the original Latin language. And this is what he calculated. Sardinian, 8%. Italian, 12%. Spanish, 20%. Romanian, 23.5%. Occitan, 25%. Portuguese, 31%. French, 44%. French and Portuguese there have shifted considerably more. Now that's not lexical similarity. Those are the sounds. Portuguese and French have more vowels than the other Romance languages. Now I'll admit Romanian has a lot of diphthongs, where you compress vowels together. But look at this. Vowels, Portuguese, 14. Welsh, 14. And the total number of sounds, 37 in Portuguese to 45 in Welsh. Quite high in Irish as well, but Spanish and Basque are quite low, and French, 39. Romanian's quite low, but it makes up for it in diphthongs, combinations of vowels. The point being that Portuguese, in terms of the amount of sounds available, is actually closer on a spectrum to the Celtic languages than it is to most of the rest of the Romance languages. And the only other language in the Romance family, really, French. I mean, Gallo, but see my video on that, but it's not a big language. French and Portuguese really do stand apart in terms of the sounds that are available. And this has a lot to do with the influence of the non-Latin languages that the Romans came into contact with when they conquered these lands. All of the lands north of Tuscany and across through the west, France, Catalonia, Spain, Portugal, these were occupied by Celtic peoples speaking Celtic languages. Yes, in parts of southern Portugal and parts of Spain there were other indo-european groups. But the main groups were these Iberian Celtic-speaking peoples. And you have the Basques for the north. But the point is, these Romance languages came out of a Celtic-speaking people merging with the Roman Empire. Well, being conquered by them. I wouldn't say merging. It wasn't exactly peaceful, was it? No. Southern France, central Spain and Catalonia were much closer to Rome's core, its administrative capitals. But northern France, where the langue d'oil or oil languages would birth, and what is now Galicia, north of Portugal and Asturias, where the future Portuguese language would have its cradle. These lands were also further removed from the senatorial provinces and the more prestigious centers of Latin, so any underlayer would have been able to hold on further. In a video by Lang Focus, he goes into why Portuguese, if you're a Polish or Russian speaker, kind of sounds Slavic, and vice versa. It's an interesting video, but he raises a good point. It does sound different. He doesn't go into why those sounds came to be in the first place, and that's what I'm suggesting here. There's an underlayer in Portuguese which is considerably different. Galicia and Asturias, where the earliest seeds of the Portuguese language came from, being both so far removed from the prestigious centers of the empire, combined with a heavy underlayer of Celtic, which has a broader spectrum of sound phonemes than Latin, like Slavic languages do, could be the reason. So why not Spanish, first of all? I mean, it's kind of the same landmass and adjacent. Well, when the Islamic colonization came in, the kingdom that would eventually form Spain, or Castile, that language that was spoken in that kingdom, was adjacent right next door to the Basques, and cut off by a mountain ridge from those who would eventually speak Portuguese. Basque and Spanish are utterly different languages, but they do have a similar range of sounds, very similar, and a lot of words loaned between them. But Portuguese did not have that influence to the same extent. Almost all the words from Basque and Portuguese come through Spanish. And being further removed from other influences, it has less Arabic in it as well. It does have Arabic. But that's not the second biggest layer after Latin like it is in Spanish. The second biggest layer after Latin in Portuguese is Celtic. So what about French? You're saying it has a wide girth of sounds as well. French saw its Celtic influences largely replaced by Germanic influences. So what about sounds? One that leapt out at me was the ending sh sound in Portuguese, which you get a lot in southern Welsh dialects. So here's what I mean. Temos cerveja. We have beer. That word for beer there actually does come from Celtic. In Welsh it's cwrw, and it would have come from an older word, cyrfau. Both of us. Nós os dois. Nós os dois. This word for two here at the end, dois, it's almost identical to Welsh doi, a South Welsh dialect for the word for two, doi. These different S's produce different sounds in different instances in Portuguese. You see the same thing happening in Celtic languages. Not to such an extent at all, but it does happen. Also, I wanted to point out a few sounds, like owl with an AU or an OU. These diphthongs are in Welsh. And in Welsh we have these. All of those sounds are in Portuguese, and none of those sounds are in most of the other Romance languages. So what about Portuguese words in general? It would be weird if there were no Portuguese place names which come from Celtic, wouldn't it? Considering that Celts were living in the area for thousands of years. Portugal itself, the name, now it's disputed, we're not exactly sure, but it could be Portus Calus, the port of the Galici tribe. Galici tribe. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm not pretending I know. But that was a big tribe, and they fought some serious wars with Rome, which were quite bleak. I mean, mass suicide. Moving on. Boi dobra. This is a combination of victory and hill. Boedi or boido. Cognate with Welsh bydd, a great win or a benefit. Buddigoliaeth, victory. And the Celtic briga, hill. In Welsh, brig, the summit or tops of. Also, Columbriga, meaning hill fortress of the rocky citadel. Oh, that's nice. These briga names are all over, especially the north of Portugal and the inland bits. And this was just like Iron Age Celtic hill forts, basically. But not Braga, because it's down in a bit. And this was the center of a Celtic people called the Braceri, and we're not exactly sure what this name means. It's clearly from their name, but we don't know. So this town, the Romans came in as they did, and after the people had all, well, in this case, killed themselves, they built a Roman imposition town upon it. Moving on. Evora. And this comes from Ebora, a Celtic confederacy. And this shares, if you know any Welsh, it comes from the same root as Efrog, the Welsh word for York, meaning of the yew trees. Leria, coming from a word that would sound something like laro, cognate with Welsh llawr, meaning floor, and Breton, ler, ground, coming through it into Galicia and Portuguese to mean small farming plots on the floor of a valley or a low bit of land. And as you would expect, there are rivers, especially in the north of Portugal, with Celtic roots. Now I'll mention the south. There were other indo-european groups in the south of Portugal. Lusitanian was probably a fusion of Celtic and another indo-european group, so it's not as pertinent. The Portuguese language came from the north of Portugal and Galicia anyway. The next place is a river. The River Douro probably means water, like Dover in England. Dŵr in Welsh today is water from Dover. Dowr in Breton today. And a tributary of the Douro, Tamega. Have you ever heard of the River Thames? In Welsh, Tafwys. But in Cornwall, they didn't have the same shift between M and V to such an extent that Welsh did. The River Tamar. This is the same root, and this tam bit means murky or dark or thick. And ega, the end of that, comes from older Celtic ika, which squished together the consonant, softening it, eventually ega. In Welsh today, eg or egg endings are this, pertaining to, or being of. So this river, Tamiga, means pertaining to that which is dark and murky. I like that. Quite a few names for people in Portuguese are of Celtic root. Tristão comes from droost, an upheaval, a riot, a tumult. And see my Pictish videos, because there's 10 kings of Pictland who were named Droost or Dresht. That's a lot of guys of a high rank with this name. And in Welsh today, Tristan, Cornish and Breton Tristan, giving us the tale Tristan ag Isillt, related to the King Arthur legend. And speaking of King Arthur, in Portuguese, Arthur. I'm not pretending I pronounced it right in Portuguese, but you get the idea. And Brigid in English, Brigida, Brigida. This compared to Irish, Brigid, the exalted goddess, the high, bright one. And there are quite a few family names, actually, quite a lot, comparatively. Those were just first names for people in Portuguese coming from a Celtic root. But the family names are more abundant. Vassalo comes from a root like gwas in Welsh, meaning lad boy or servant, or gwas in Breton, likewise. Lemos. This comes from Celtic lemo, elm tree. See my video on English place names, because the lem at the beginning is a fossilized version of the Old Welsh llym or llwym for elm trees. Leamington Spa. This changed in Welsh to llwyf, a v sound at the end, but it didn't change in whatever happened down in Portugal. Lemos, elm trees. Another common name in Portugal is basilar or basilo, coming from bacios, a young man in the Celtic. Welsh, cognate bach, small, and in Breton, bian, and Irish, biag. Biag. Menino. I think this means a boy, correct me if I'm wrong there, coming from Celtic mena. In Celtic languages, this has a cognate meaning a kid or a young goat. Irish meanan, Welsh min, Breton men. So they're changing meanings, but it's agricultural, it's rural, it's to do with children. And laginia. This is a cognate of Welsh llain, meaning a long narrow strip of land or a blade, but in Portuguese it comes from something like a mattock, this type of tool, useful for planting crops in rocky areas. You know, like Portugal. Enough of that. What about general vocabulary? French, beret, comes from Gaulish, biros, a short hood, cognate with Welsh, bir, short. Portuguese for cap, parreche, from the same root. Trado, meaning an auger or like a drill bit. In Welsh, tarder, though I would use ebech, but tarder is fine. Pitada, a pinch, handful. This is a far cognate with Welsh peth, thing, and Pictish, pet, pit, meaning a bit of farmland, as well as pesa, also from the same root, a piece, and these are ultimately from Gaulish, petsy, a piece, a bit of cloth, probably. Lota, a fish market, from Gaulish lota, flat fish. See Welsh, llydan, meaning broad, or lleden, a flat fish. Most of these words that are from Celtic are from a low-ranking, low-prestige root, craftsmanship, far-back rural countryside, upland pasture, that kind of root that is the last bit of a culture to be let go before it dies. But not one, which I find interesting. Brio means pride or panache in Portuguese, but brie is renown or prestige in Welsh. I wonder why that one was able to survive. I don't know. Estimates begin at around 1,500 words of Portuguese are directly from Celtic, but I would put it at a lot higher, because as we've seen, most of these words are things to do with children, small animals, agricultural, the rural farming hinterland, low prestige elements. Many, many more would have come in which have just been blended into Latin and then passed into Portuguese, which would change the sounds of the language considerably. So how Celtic, to answer the question, is Portuguese? Well, I would say 10 to 15%, at least. But even as someone who's studied Celtic languages, trying to pick between what's Latin and what's Celtic is almost impossible, because the Italic and Celtic languages were so similar at that earlier point in history that as they were blended together and Latin was prestige on top, it would have just gradually Latinized those elements and blended them seamlessly into what eventually became Portuguese. We don't know, it's impossible to say, but I think that Celtic underlayer has given Portuguese something unique and distinguishable from other Romance languages. A bit of flavor. Question: do you speak Portuguese? What's your impression of the underlayers within your language? Do you think Celtic is a considerable influence? Or if you're learning Portuguese and you know other languages, what have you taken to be the languages that have helped you learn Portuguese? Or what's your impression of the language generally? Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. Obrigado. We'll see you next time.